Welcome, everybody, to the Bass Fug Podcast. Today, we have a very, very, very special guest today. We're talking about the old times. My buddy Colin, a.k.a. DJ Fishead, 1H. 1H, don't put the 2 H's. How are you, Colin?
Not too bad. A little hard of hearing because I closed out a show last night. So,
tell us about the show last night.
It was, it was an all vinyl night. So everybody was playing vinyl, which means that I kind of did what I normally do, which is play vinyl.
Okay.
But everybody else skipped on the CDJs and got back to the old 12s. So it was kind of fun.
How much vinyl do you have?
I'd say right around 10,000 records.
That's crazy. Moving that from Montreal to Winnipeg must have been a pain in the ass.
Honestly, that was probably the easiest part of my move. It was expensive, but I spent 15 years in Montreal working for a music distro. So I had access to proper boxes to do it. And I had a lot of training in packing records. Okay. So I approached it really systematically. I boxed stuff up from my shelves to the crate, basically put like Cartesian coordinates for like where the records would go back up onto the shelves when the shelves were reassembled on this end.
Nice.
And it was like really quick.
Huh. So you've been collecting, I guess, your whole career. What are your like top 10 gems? Because I know I collect VHS and I have a few gems.
Oh man, you should talk to James from Ghost Twin about VHS. He just posted yesterday about renting a U-Haul and picking up a collection of like 3,000 VHS tapes from some guy out in the country. So.
Props to James.
But he sees that like the Ghost Twin stuff's great. They do like great Winnipeg like synthwave stuff. Cool.
So let's talk about your beginnings. Because you've had a long career. I mean, you've done things we played together, but I wouldn't say that's your highlight, playing with a guy like me, a Breakcore guy. But you did mixes for Brave New Waves. You were part of the early rave scene. You were doing a bunch of Midwest hardcore. Let's take it from the beginning. How did you start?
I remember being a little kid and playing around with doing like recording mixes with my dad's record player, just like the hair metal stuff I was listening to in like elementary school, and doing like radio voice between them that sounded terrible. I don't even think I had a proper mic. I think we just talked into something that had a record on it. And in high school, for extra credit, I got involved with a school radio station, which is basically just like a PA system that broadcast into the cafeteria while people had lunch. And we just basically cleared out the room and had the place to ourselves, and then people wouldn't complain about what we were playing.
What were you playing?
Oh, a lot of industrial, alternative, not a lot of top 40, which is probably what people wanted us to play, but just whatever weird stuff. I was obsessively listening to Brave New Waves like every night. I was probably up till, what they used to do was they'd run one show that was like that week's show, and then they would, after that, play the show from the week before. And I think it was like from like midnight till 6 a.m. So it was like a 3-hour broadcast of new stuff. And then they'd play the 3 hours that had aired the week before. And I was recording interviews, recording music off of those. And then if I missed something, I'd stay up till 6 a.m. the next week so that I could get all the stuff that I missed. So yeah, Brave New Waves was like massive, massive, massive influence. And it was like a enormous deal for me when I got up to Montreal and was asked to actually do a couple of shows for them.
Can you explain to the listeners who may not know what Brave New Waves was?
It was the gateway drug for underground music across Canada, and countercultural in general. They'd have interviews with people, like film directors. I remember amazingly, like my introduction to techno, the first sort of proper techno I heard was there was an interview with Clive Barker on Brave New Waves, and I still got a cassette of this whole thing. And in between the breaking up the interview, they were playing the Coils themes for Hellraiser. And right after the interview ended, the first track they played was Technarchy by Cybersonic. And I remember hearing this and just, what is this record? This is not Coil, but this is incredible. And it took me like 2 years to track it down because distribution for underground techno in the early 90s was almost impossible, especially in a place like Winnipeg. It wasn't until a friend of mine started doing direct mail order and distribution through them that I was able to get my hands on a copy of it.
Yeah, it's especially even for me being from Moncton, New Brunswick. I mean, like Brave New Waves was a godsend. There was no HMV or anything there, right? If you wanted a Boards of Canada CD, you had to go to Toronto and buy it yourself or like order it,
Yeah, and it's like it's like in the pre-streaming age. I mean, people didn't have access to that, but they also didn't have access to hear it.
Yeah.
You couldn't just go on the internet and download and listen to this stuff. I mean, actually, by the time Boards of Canada was around, late 90s, I guess some of that stuff would have been on like Kazaa and things like that.
Mm.
But I mean, when I was coming up, late 80s, early 90s, starting really building my collection, I mean, it was straight going into the stores and digging and special ordering. But even hearing about stuff, you had to really sort of put yourself out there, and you had to do a lot of research. You couldn't just look up Discogs. You couldn't, you couldn't order stuff off Amazon. I mean, all those things didn't exist like 30 years ago. So,
and like,
it's a much changed environment.
And it's like you're saying, the unknown, the known unknowns, right? There's stuff out there and you don't even know about it.
Yeah. And I don't know, I kind of miss, there's aspects of that I really miss. I think there's huge benefits to what's happened. But I also feel like it's homogenized things. 30 years ago, there was really the sense that communities would have their own kind of sound. They'd have their own sort of set of influences because things weren't instantaneously connected. I mean, even when I started going down to the Midwest in the mid 90s, it was like we'd go down there and give demo tapes to people, and they'd give tapes back to us, and there'd be this sort of meeting of minds where everybody was sort of finding out what everybody had been doing, and then we'd come back and spend the winter sort of building on this sort of inspiration. And when we got back like in the spring and met up with these people again, you'd hear what direction they'd gone off in, and we would have gone off in a different direction. And I think now with people just being able to share things so quickly, if it's weird, because I think on the one hand, it really helps develop people a lot faster because you can get instantaneous feedback on what you're doing.
Yeah.
But I also feel like it eliminates the way that people can take something and go in the wrong direction long enough that they come up with something brilliant that's unprecedented.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there's probably times in your life where you felt creatively, you know, that you were sort of out of sync with everything. And then all of a sudden, all these things that hadn't been working suddenly like fell into place. And I feel like now there's such a potential for people to correct those things really early that you don't have as much opportunity to make mistakes into brilliance.
Yeah, there's no incubation period for the idea, or to even try to grow an idea. I definitely agree with that. Yeah, for sure. And also too, since it's so quick there's this instant gratification of getting, new inspiration. You tend to get a lot of copycats, but sort of in the wrong way, I guess, in some cases,
Yeah, like the whole the whole thing with Dormouse, people like jacking his tracks. And he just did that sample jackers thing, which is kind of hilarious.
I saw that on Instagram, but I didn't get the whole story. What happened? Someone sampled his record, or?
Yeah, so somebody lifted stuff. I can't remember their name, but even if I did, I don't feel like giving them any more attention. But essentially, yeah, somebody lifted really obviously like samples of his voice on a record that he did with Otto, and then released it as their own track. And it's just like, excuse me. So yeah, it's and yeah, I mean, there's stuff like that goes on. There's so much, like, I mean, I even like in other genres, you see people taking other people's mixes and putting them up on SoundCloud and saying it's their own, or, I mean, there's always been sort of like varying degrees of plagiarism around.
It happened with Crystal Castles in the chiptune community about 10 years ago. They were accused of, it's pretty damning, taking a 10-second long samples of a guy's song and just looping it a couple of times to make a full song, and there was some drama there. Timberland did that too with a really big Nelly Furtado song too. He took like the entire chorus or something from another chiptune guy. Yeah, it seems like it's getting more common.
No, I think people are more vigilant and diligent about it. But I mean, it's like foundational sort of in hip hop,
of course,
and in a lot of electronic music to sample. But I think when you start, I also do think there's a line.
There's an intent to it. There's I'm sampling a couple of seconds for fun, and then I'm ripping this guy off.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much stuff out there that I remember Justin at Low Res at one point saying that if you're making, if you're selling less than 10,000 copies of something, cease and desist letters are suitable for framing.
Yeah.
It's like, they have like a form letter that they send out, but if there's no money in suing you, then they're not going to sue.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think the playing field's changed just because revenue streams have dropped so drastically for a lot of the music industry.
Do you think people appreciate music the same way now because of the ease of access, or do you think it's completely different?
I mean, I don't know whether I would say appreciation has changed. I think the way people consume, the way people listen to music has changed. I think the way people find music has changed, but I hesitate to say that appreciation has changed. I think people still enjoy music as much as they ever have. I just think the ways that people find it, the ways that they obtain it, those have changed.
Let's continue out of high school here. You said you were playing for the cafeteria. You're playing, you're floor clearing. Your words. When did you start playing your first shows?
So with my when I graduated from high school, and I realized I wasn't going to have access to the equipment there. I bought a mixer. And probably that fall, like that summer I actually spent living in Montreal, so I wasn't around my gear. But that fall when I got back, I started playing around with putting mixes together, doing mixtapes. And I guess my first DJ gig was November 1991. So pretty much fresh out of high school at an all ages club called the Love Bomb that a record store owner in Montreal or in Winnipeg had set up. And I mean, it was an interesting crew of people that were at that show. I mean, Snares was there, as like probably around the time that I first met him. Not Half was working the door and was also DJing that night. So yeah, it was weird times, but yeah, the roots here kind of go back a long ways in Winnipeg.
What were you playing in 1991? Were you playing like hip house?
No. Probably a straight mix of like industrial, some techno, like what techno I could find at that time. And like alternative rock stuff. So, like Pixies, Jane's Addiction, like early 90s, like underground stuff. And I mean, I didn't have access to sort of having stuff split up by genre. I didn't have enough records. I think I probably had like 120, 150 records at that point. So I really couldn't do like a dedicated set of techno. I couldn't do a dedicated set of this. And for that night, I was playing like the whole night. So sort of like constantly shifting, changing. That's probably a huge influence on how I learned how to DJ and not sticking to genre norms throughout a set. I think one of the other things that had a massive influence on how I play was when I first started, I had two belt drive turntables and only one of them had pitch control.
Okay.
So I had to learn how to pitch up the record that was playing in order to beat match the record that I was trying to bring in half the time, because I could only do pitch adjust on one deck.
Yeah.
So there's a very different sort of set of technical challenges that I had to conquer early on that I think set for a different development than a lot of other people have. And I actually ran with that setup probably for the first 4 years that I was DJing. That probably wasn't until I think late 94 that I finally got 1200s.
So in 94, what I'm trying to get at is I'm trying to get the evolution here. I'm starting to get it. Like, how did we get to, I guess you're more known for breakcore, hardcore. You never really the shows that we played, you'd play like everything, you know?
Yeah.
But that's another thing that kind of confuses me too. Like, I feel like you've always, from just talking to you now, I feel like you've always sort of just played everything, but you were kind of in this one sort of subculture of hardcore, breakcore. So how did you evolve from industrial goth alternative to hardcore kind of breakcore? And how did you get in that niche?
I mean, for me, like going from like the EVM kind of industrial, so frontline assembly, front 242, some of the ministry stuff, like depending on the period, like, I mean, Twitch, I think
with sympathy,
less so. I mean, that's kind of straight synth pop, but if you listen to Twitch, and Adrian Sherwood's involvement on that, and the kick drums on that are some of the like loudest, heaviest kick drums I've ever heard. I remember thinking when I saw Autechre play on the Try Repete tour that they'd basically taken that kick drum sound and used it when they were playing stuff like Second Bad Vilbel live, which was face melting. That was incredibly intense. And I hadn't heard the album at that point. I'd heard the earlier stuff that was a lot mellower, chiller, and was astounded at how heavy they could go, how dark they could get, how noisy they got. That is actually one of my favorite shows of all time.
But how did you get to the hardcore? How did you get to the Fishead as being a hardcore breakcore icon in the community?
Well, I mean, as I said, from the industrial side of things, I moved into, it just seemed like a logical progression to move into sort of driving techno. There's a lot of connections. And I didn't feel like there was that much difference. You know, and there's people that sort of work from both sides too. You know, you look at like Richie Houghton using Nitzareb tracks in mixes, or, you know, even like Terrence Fixmer working with Douglas McCarthy and doing sort of Nitzareb kind of stuff now. I mean, that just seemed to be a logical progression, moving from that kind of beat-driven industrial into techno. And I was the heavier, faster, darker techno is sort of what sort of grabbed me. In 1994, when Drop Bass came up here, they did a show called Brave New Assembly. So it was Kurt and Pat, Jethrox and Jedediah from Drop Bass, Hyperactive from Chicago, Woody McBride, DJ ESP from Minneapolis. I think Drop Bass had 2 records out at that point. And it was, I mean, like hardcore, hard acid. And that kind of galvanized the direction I was going in. Knowing that stuff was out there when I started going down to Minneapolis and buying records, like that summer, and coming back, and that was sort of the direction I wanted to go in. And then those records started showing up in stores up here, but a lot of people were still playing a lot of people here were playing like house, or they specialized into more minimal, lighter techno. And I just gravitated towards the harder stuff, and nobody else was really interested in going off in that direction. So for a long time, I just got gigs because I was the only person in the city that was doing that kind of sound. And formed my own particular style. I went off in my own direction, put things together that I don't think other people. So I think I hear music or hear the possibilities for mixing things differently. I don't like sort of laying down the same mixes over and over and over again. Like my method of rehearsing is just grabbing random records and seeing what I can make work, and just playing around with different things. And by like 96, when I started sending tapes out places, and started getting gigs out of town, and started meeting sort of like-minded people. And it was when I went down to Milwaukee for the first time and played a show with Tron and Dormouse and connected with all those guys. That was a massive moment, and they're all sort of people that I consider still close to this day. I don't know if I answered that question.
No, you did. You did. Because for me, I'm trying to figure, like, where is that birthplace? Where's that sweet spot? Because I know a lot of guys who are into industrial or goth that I try to show them breakcore, and they're like, "This fucking sucks. Like, I'll never listen to this," you know. But they listen to Skinny Puppy, and they listen to Frontline Assembly or whatever, you know. And I always thought that breakcore was sort of the Venn diagram between industrial and sort of rave culture. And I don't know if I'm wrong to say that or not, but that's what got me into it. That's sort of what got my ear, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's different to just sort of introduce people that are into industrial into a fully fledged other genre. Yeah. It was being part or sort of witnessing the development is more like watching these baby steps, and at a certain point going, whoa, how did we get here? Yeah. Because that's kind of what happened. I mean, the whole breakcore thing, really stemmed out of the digital hardcore stuff that was going on, like 95, 96. I mean, the first Atari Teenage Riot album, Delete Yourself, is still kind of cut and paste rave culture stuff. But by the time you get 2 or 3 releases deep in the albums on DHR, and you get into like the really chopped up Ecator stuff, the second, like the later Atari Teenage Riot, the Destroyer comp the Alec Empire did, you're getting into like stuff where it's very different. It's even very different from drum and bass. There's so much more distortion.
Yeah. There's vocals.
Yeah. And then I think in the Midwest, that was definitely an influence. I mean, Alec Empire, I think Atari Teenage Riot played at Drop Bass Party, Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, that I think was in early 97. And I think one of the things that really happened was you started, like, a lot of people in the Midwest that were working with breakbeats were also still working with like really heavy, like gabber kicks. And that, I think, is what sort of helped form a lot of the Midwest sound. And not doing the vocals.
I see. So how would you best describe Midwest hardcore?
I don't know whether you can sort of put it. I mean, it's a very diverse thing. You listen to like what different producers were doing. There's a lot of distinct styles going on. There's a lot of people that I feel never got the attention that they deserved. That there's some absolutely foundationally brilliant records that are sort of like hidden classics. I think the Faust EP by Davros, Abel Kane. I think it's actually an Abel Kane record on low res is still, I mean, that to me is probably his reinterpretation of music from Agira, the Wrath of God, is the ultimate sort of Midwest breakcore anthem. And I don't even know how many people know that record.
What is the difference between a Wisconsin barn party and a party that you would have in Winnipeg?
Chaos.
Okay.
Like the barn parties, there was such a loose grasp on control there. It was such a chaotic environment. And it was too chaotic to last. But while it was going, I mean, it was insane. I mean, the first party at the barn that I went to was massive, and Drop Bass did a Halloween party called Helter Skelter that had I played, Dormouse played, Johnson played, Delta 9, Roland the Bastard. It was insane. They had a full-size boat, okay, like a 6-person fiberglass boat set up with a system of pulleys that was like rocking back and forth inside a tent that was just playing dark ambient music out in the middle of like this field. And then they had all the hardcore stuff going on in the barn. They had people doing projections and visuals on grain silos at this barn.
That's awesome.
Which was like, some of it was pornographic, like 15 feet high on this barn. And the police showed up because they saw that from down the road. Like, calm the music down. At some point, it was decided we're going to burn the boat. People just cut the ropes that were holding the boat up, and we carried it and tossed it into the bonfire.
Oh, wow.
Probably eliminated several years of life from everybody. I have no idea how toxic the fumes from the bonfire were. I mean, it was just, and that was the beginning. You know, by the time the white trash wrestling parties started up, there were, pig roasts and like a mud wrestling pit that was, it wasn't always the best weather when they're having this. It was like ice cold, like muddy water, and people like mud wrestling in it. It was bizarre and amazing, and I don't think it'll ever be replicated. I don't know whether it should be. This is the furthest thing from like safe, the furthest thing from supervised. If you've ever heard the legends of what went on at meat shows, they pale in comparison to what it was like to actually witness that.
I've never heard the legends.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether the legends need to be repeated at this point, but it was definitely the most performative hardcore music that I've ever experienced. It was originally the original Meat project was was Josh Anonymous and Marty Davros. And then it sort of got turned into a full-fledged band with Josh playing drums and Marty doing tracker stuff. And then Dormouse was a front man, and I'm pretty sure Stunt Rock was involved, but he might have, I don't even know whether he was involved musically or just performatively. It was insane. There's enough written about it that I don't know whether people want me repeating what went on.
Okay. Speaking of mud wrestling, you are a wrestler from what it's been told on this podcast before, right?
Yeah, you got the story from Kurt, Submerged.
So were you like Roman Greco wrestling or backyard wrestling? What was this?
In high school, I was a freestyle wrestler and 3-time national finalist for Canada.
Oh, damn.
So, yeah, I've got sort of legitimate credentials in that arena. I won the national championships once. I placed second twice.
That's crazy. That's hard to do. I was on the wrestling team myself. That's quite the feat.
It was a lot of time. I was probably training 3.5 to 4 hours a night, 5 nights a week, and then training sessions on Saturdays. So over the course of like the 3.5, 4 years that I was doing it, I was probably training like 20 to 25 hours a week, every week.
But you're also a fan of professional wrestling, right? There's a picture of you with Mankind online somewhere.
That's from Further 98. We wandered into a grocery store in Kankakee, Illinois, and there was a cutout of Mankind pitching beefaroni or something.
Yeah.
And I posed for a photo with it as if it was an actual person. And then something about the camera flash, it actually came out in a way that it almost looks like I'm with an actual person. But
so I bring this up because I noticed that lately, not even lately, but there's no music genre that I know of that has sampled professional wrestling as much as maybe breakcore. Do you agree on that?
I don't know whether it's genre wide or whether it's just a handful of people that have sampled it. I mean, Dan Dormouse has obviously sampled a fair amount of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, the white trash wrestling thing definitely developed along those lines. Dan's costume at Helter Skelter was actually Hulk Hogan. So
I find it's the same appeal of chaos, you know, like pro wrestling, especially like ECW. Like ECW is a very like breakcore esque fiasco.
Yeah, well, funny thing is, summer 2000, and people can actually check this if they want, but Hardcore Heaven 2000, the ECW pay-per-view, was at the Rave Ballroom in Milwaukee, where Drop Bass was doing their New Year's parties. And a whole bunch of us that had been going to the barn parties went to the ECW pay-per-view, and we were up on the balcony. And when Sandman comes out, on the pay-per-view and makes his appearance. He walks out on the balcony. He came out right beside us. And if you've got a VHS copy or are able to find video of it online, you can pretty clearly see like a small posse of people and an Attic Records t-shirt, like nice. Right there on the balcony behind Sandman. So
you could use the WWE Network. They have all the ECW pay-per-views on there archived.
Yeah, it was still, that was that was very much pre-merger, but
no, they have all the way like Born to Be Wired. They have everything from 1997 and earlier too, I think.
But it was a couple of years before they merged in. I guess now they've got all that stuff as intellectual property, but it's before McMahon had his hands on what was going on over there. But honestly, like, my friend Dav, who was throwing events in Winnipeg, at one point, like mid-90s, said, every single thing that you ever need to learn about event promotion can be learned from pro wrestling.
I totally agree.
And he said, look at how they use lights, look at how they use music, look at how they build anticipation, look at how they sort of manufacture. He said, it is this stuck with me. He said, it's the only infomercial that can sell advertisement.
That's very
astute. He said basically, if you look at what the show is, it's an infomercial selling their pay-per-views.
Yeah.
And they're able to sell advertisements to other companies because they've managed to build that level of interest.
And even the performance wise, for me, believe it or not, I'm pretty shy and recluse, but every time I had to play a show, I just copy whatever the fuck I saw on WWF or ECW, And if they were breaking stuff, it's like, you got to break stuff, right?
I wish I'd seen you moonsault the Super Nintendo.
Well, that guy you were talking about before, SNES Destroyer, the guy, that's some WWF shit right there. For those of you who don't know at home, this guy, he was playing MIDI grind, screaming over top of it, and then using some garrisons that he bought at the Army surplus would stomp on a Nintendo to death.
Yeah, no moonsaults though.
No moonsaults. Yeah, no moonsaults. So there
might have been the people's elbow.
Maybe. Did you want to talk about those Quebec shows?
I only went to a couple of them, actually. I played that Free Candy.
Yes.
So, and yeah, I think I only made it up to Quebec City a couple of times. That one, and I played like some big show that was at like a ski lodge outside the city.
And I think we booked you at in Montreal. I think it was at Sala Rosa. I think it was.
Yeah, was that one of the shows with Mithra?
Yes, yeah. One of those. I remember we found you because I think there wasn't really like a breakcore scene going on at that time, and we were trying to find people to play these shows, and I think it was around 2002, 2003. No.
I moved to Montreal in 2002. I kind of feel like it was a bit later than that. And I would say 2006, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, and we found you online. I think we found your website, your live journal or something. And that was fun. I think the first time we played a show was at that Sala Rosa show. Yeah, with SNES Destroyer. I have no idea where that guy is now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have no idea where any of those guys are right now.
Yeah. So did you, how was that for you? Like the second wave of breakcore, because you were there in the beginning and then it seems like it might have petered out for a couple of years, but then I think snares got really popular and and revived the whole genre. I think recreated the whole genre.
I think honestly, I mean, there was some attention being paid to what was going on in the Midwest. I mean, there was the infamous Spin article about like DJs who throw meat back in the late 90s that was, you know, talking literally actually about the barn parties. But I think, you know, when Aaron stuff took off, it legitimately, it wasn't a resurgence. It was taking it to a completely different level. I think what he did goes so far beyond what anyone's expectations for what the genre could be were. And I think part of that has to do with his disregard for repeating himself, for always sort of being interested in exploring different directions. I mean, you listen to any of his albums and they have their distinct sound. And I think there's certain ideas or fragments of ideas that connect them together as the body of work from one particular person. But at the same time, like, no two albums sound the same.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, you have like Huge Chrome Cylinder Unfolding, and then you have a Chocolate Wheelchair. They were basically released in the same year or two, and they're completely different albums.
Huge Chrome Cylinder Unfolding. It's a weird thing because I still think that probably my favorite album by him.
Same.
But part of that is that was the first album that came out after I moved to Montreal. And it was the first album of his that I didn't hear from him. You know, prior to that, it was sort of like we'd see each other. He'd play me tracks. And then when the albums came out, it was stuff that I'd heard in live sets. It was stuff that I'd heard in his basement. When Huge Chrome Cylinder Unfolding came out, it was the first time that I'd been hit full in the face with a complete album where I hadn't heard any of it prior to that period. And it was the first time that I heard a fully realized album that was completely unfamiliar to me. So it was a very amazing experience.
And it was good too, because the impact that it made for the rest of, I guess, I'll say experimental electronic music. You know, I feel that maybe this is just conspiracy or whatever, but I feel like a lot of other producers sort of stepped up a little bit and tried to, I guess, emulate the frantic sequencing that he brought to stage. And that 3 years, just everything that was being released by everybody was amazing, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a creative period. And I can't sort of overestimate the influence that record had. But I think, you know, you look at sort of the direction things went after that. And, you know, when Rozpsyllid came out and it introduces string sounds manipulated in ways that I'd never heard before. And I remember telling him that it influenced like my DJing too, because I couldn't handle those records the same way that I'd handled his previous records. Mm. The same techniques that you use with digital distortion and with electronic tones don't you can't manipulate them the same way as you can when you have these organic string sounds. So it really like like those albums, like each one almost like fundamentally changed the way that I had to approach playing it. So I mean, yeah, it's sort of like every album that came out, I had to learn new techniques in order to fit those into what I was doing. And that was actually like one of those things that's like really exciting to me. There's a number of other records that have done that, where you just sort of have to adapt your playing style in order to fit them into your sets. But there's very few people that have ever done that with any consistency with every record, where it's like, this is a whole new set of demands. I have to figure this out.
Did you find that maybe like I remember his earlier records, like Seven's Med, which is more like kind of traditional. I think it's such a different sound than what was happening later on. Did you find yourself maybe resisting some of the changes in sound and trying to keep it more traditional, or were you embracing that?
Never. I think the whole foundation of moving forward is acknowledging and building, but also rejecting tradition. And I feel like new sound sets, new ideas, and these shifts are so necessary to avoid stagnation, to avoid repeating the same thing over and over and over again. And there's genres that have done that. And there's a certain amount of stuff within breakcore that does get repetitive, but there's stuff that's sort of always kind of trying to kick things into the future.
What do you think about modern breakcore? Do you think there's a particular sound? Do you think it's evolving the same way? Or do you think there's other genres that are more, I guess, moving the post forward on that?
It's a tricky question. Partly because I'm so grounded in vinyl. And there's so much out there that only ever comes out in digital. So I almost feel like musically I'm lagging severely behind, and that my lag time has increased massively over the years. Now that we're in a situation where, digital releases are the norm. And as someone who still hasn't embraced digital DJing, I'm not hearing everything that's out there. It's like, I'll hear what's released on vinyl. And even then, with the amount of distributors that have gone under, and, the switch to sort of ordering things direct from Bandcamp, it's great at one level, but it's also difficult to sort of consolidate a large order to reduce shipping costs, because you're sort of having to order things like piecemeal from here, from there, from here, from there. And with the demand for vinyl overall having increased in the last few years through the major labels, it's no longer as affordable as it used to be, because it's an in-demand product. And I think with the lacquer manufacturer fire a little while ago, it's that bottleneck is only going to get worse.
Yeah, I heard about that. It's like it's like 90% of the vinyl comes from that place, or
no, it's the lacquers, which is basically what they cut the positive master into. And then the stampers for manufacturing the vinyls are metal negatives of that original lacquer that they then use to create records that replicate the lacquer. It was a plant that made lacquers. So they made the original source, mother copy that stampers are made from, that burnt down. That's my understanding. And they were serving 90% of new records being cut. So,
do you think Spotify had something to do with it? They went with some Molotov cocktails?
I mean, there's been so many. I mean, you look at like what happened. There's a fire at Universal a few years ago.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Where they lost master tapes, and they're still sort of leaking out information about what was lost in that fire, like the original master recordings for so many things. I mean, so much physical media is so fragile. If you look through the history of physical media, you look at what was lost to fires back in like the silent film age, because of the flammability of film stocks in that era, which you see replicated. And they talk about that in Inglourious Basterds when they burn down the theater, because the film stock is that flammable. It just happens. It's so much of the source material is impermanent. It seems permanent because it's physical. Digital is kind of ephemeral. It's not something that you can like reach out and handle unless you put it onto a physical media. But even physical media is pretty fragile. It can just be destroyed.
You mentioned Inglourious Basterds. You're also a cinephile. Is that a correct label, or?
Yeah, I've actually got a master's degree in film.
The similarities between cinema and music, are there any, or do you think that they're completely separate from one another in terms of expressing creativity and contributing to culture?
I think there's some overlap. There's filmmakers that are musicians. There's filmmakers that are heavily invested in music. There's filmmakers that do their own scores.
John
and some of them are, John Carpenter is a great example. Jim Jarmusch is another example. You look at the stuff that he's been doing lately. But I mean, when I was working in the record shop in Montreal, we got like indie rock records that Jarmusch was doing in like the 80s. There's overlap, I think, in terms of creativity. There's filmmakers that are heavily invested in what music goes into their films. There's filmmakers where it's haphazard and it works. I watched McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and the whole soundtrack's Leonard Cohen. But that film had basically been made and shot, and Robert Altman heard Leonard Cohen songs at a party and went, "This is what I need for the soundtrack for my film," and approached him and got the rights to 3 songs to use for it. But then there's, other filmmakers, Gus Van Sant, Greg Araki, who it's like the music is part of the conception of the finished piece.
I like John Carpenter. I think his Halloween soundtrack is amazing. I listened to it like 40 times when it came out.
It's great, but it's also a riff on what Goblin was doing. Carpenter.
That's a Suspiria, right?
Pre-Suspiria, I'm pretty sure Carpenter cites the music from Profonda Rosso, Deep Red Hatchet Murders, as one of the major influences on the Halloween soundtrack.
Cool. I'm not a cinema guy. I'm a VHS guy. So, but
you can probably find a copy of Deep Red out there.
Awesome. I have a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time. This is going to be a hit, I could tell you.
Are we going to go back to the question that you asked at the very beginning that I sidelined?
What was the question that you sidelined?
You asked about 10 gems in my record collection.
Yeah.
And I totally sidestepped it.
Yeah. I thought maybe it was a lame question you didn't want to answer it. So, but I have it written down here. What are your 10 gems?
Off the top of my head, I mean, I already mentioned the Faust EP by Abel Kane. Definitely everybody should have a copy of that record if you're interested in breakcore. Unfortunately, I don't think there's many copies out there, because at one point I ordered more copies from Justin, and I think he sent me everything he had left in stock, because he said, you care about this record more than anyone, you should have it. And I've given away a bunch to people over the years. Severed Head's back catalog, like everything, especially like their 80s stuff, is absolutely amazing. The guys from Nasenbluten told me that they got their idea for doing lock grooves from the Severed Heads records that were coming out at that period, where they would just end these records and it would just run out to like these annoying sounds. I mean, there's so much sort of just deep cut, weird, like acid underground stuff. All the records I have, like by Mouse and No Name, I think they're two sisters from France who worked under a bunch of different names individually, but all their records, I don't think there's anything that I've ever heard that builds and works with the kind of rhythm sets and the kind of sound sets that they do. The Hangar Liquide back catalog, La Peste, that whole sort of flashcore sound, it's connected to Mouse and No Name, but I mean, all that stuff just sort of like takes your head off. Praxis, especially the later stuff, like mid 20s, 30s on that label, just incredible. The Bass Force One collaboration, Fringelli and DJ Scud. I mean, there's so much just amazing stuff out there. I don't know if that's 10.
It's fine. It's good.
I'm like throwing out entire labels instead of individual releases. And part of that is that one of the ways that I've collected records over the years is just feeling at various points that whoever was picking what was coming out on labels had a similar sensibility to mine. And when that happened, I would just latch on and I would just be buying everything that came out on those labels until the moment when I just felt a disconnect. There's labels like Drop Bass Network, 666, Ghetto Safari, where I have every single release that's ever come out on those labels. You know, because I think everything that has come out that Kurt has chosen for Drop Bass and the sub-labels is incredible. Like Lenny D's work with Industrial Strength has built like an absolutely incredible body of work, where they even like released like proto breakcore stuff with like the really dark jungle that came out. They set up a sub-label called Machete that was putting out like Panacea stuff, but like IST I feel like it doesn't get the credit that it deserved. I mean, it was often dismissed as being like industrial strength trance, but there's like the Zenith records on there, the Mechanisms records on there are really incredible pieces. And that continues to this day. There's labels where it's just like, I hear a couple of releases and I'm like, I need to find everything they put out in the last 6 months and everything they put out in the next 6 months. And I need to get it all and keep going until it just doesn't resonate with me.
It's a very sensible strategy to do that. And I think it kind of dovetails with sort of this, I guess, ideology that I have now, where putting importance on the curators is the only way you're going to be able to consume a lot of the culture that's being put out now, because there's just so much, and there's so many more producers, it seems, or at least there isn't a monopoly on it anymore. That for me, I have to pick a label and then I just follow the labels, because if I go individually, I'm going to get lost and I'm not going to be able to find everything I'd like to find. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, but I also feel like everybody should be simultaneously trying to be their own curator. That it's a shortcut to say, like, you know, everything that Kurt puts out on Ohm Resistance is worth picking up, and it is. You know, that 7-inch subscription series that he put out, I think last year, is start to finish is incredible. And it's worthwhile to pick that up. But at the same time, everybody needs to do their own sort of legwork and get out there and unearth new things and still, you know, follow what people that are on the same wavelength are doing. Still sort of pick up what people that they resonate with are finding, but also find things on their own. And I feel like in a digital age, it's simultaneously easier to track this stuff down, but it's also harder to filter out all the noise that doesn't resonate, because there's so much more constantly bombarding us that curation is an essential skill.
That was a very fine point. I have a couple more questions. You got time for it, or I don't want to take all your time? But
no, I'm good.
Okay, these are kind of simple, lame softball questions, but I'm curious to see how you answer them. I want to know how DJing has changed over the years. I know you're sticking with vinyl, but I'm pretty sure there was a time where you were using other methods for a while, right?
Trying to think, probably 2007 to 2009, I played a handful of laptop sets using Ableton, which was fun. And I found that it delivered something that was a more consistent end product, because I make a lot of mistakes. I make a lot of bad transitions. Can be really reckless when I'm DJing, and I really don't care if I screw up. I look at it like I grew up wrestling and skateboarding, and those are things where you screwed up and you got physically punished. You got injured.
Yeah.
You know, you broke bones. you got dislocated members. And in DJing, you screw up and it sounds bad momentarily, and you fix it or you get out of it. But you're not punished the same way for risk taking as you are in other things. And what was the question again?
how DJing has changed over the years. And you were talking about how you went into Ableton for a bit.
Yeah. So yeah, I played with Ableton. I found that I was able to deliver something that was more consistent, but less improvised, less live, more pre-programmed. And there were aspects of it that I liked, but there were also aspects of it that just felt like I lost the immediacy of being able to just grab something new and throw it into the mix, because everything had to be quantized and sort of cleaned up and marked beats. I don't know if the newer versions of Ableton, I mean, I was with Ableton 5 when I was doing this. Now they're 10 or plus. A lot of that process has probably been streamlined. But yeah, it's definitely changed. I don't necessarily see it as a negative thing. I know there's a lot of people that get into debates about sync buttons and automation, and yeah, maybe certain people are going to use that to be lazier. Maybe other people are going to use it to free up their hands to do other creative things.
That's a good way of putting it.
Tighten up their programming, to work effects differently. I mean, we had James and I brought up Steve Centrific from IntelliFunk in Minneapolis to play in Winnipeg in November. And he brought his own mixer with him because of the effects send receives on it. And had, a handful of guitar pedals and things that he was working with to add effects to his set. I think there's, if you're concentrated on tightening up beat matching with vinyl, where things can slip and slide, to have autocorrect on that and freeing up the energy to do new things. To me, like, the sync button is akin to having autocorrect in a word processor. I don't think it is detrimental to the final product. I think if you're not focused on whether you're spelling things right, and you can just go back and just correct all that and just write stream of conscious, it frees you up to do what you're capable of, and eliminates one of the restrictions. It's not saying that anybody's going to reproduce the works of Shakespeare because the spelling's going to be corrected. But for people that, maybe aren't great with spelling, but are great with wordplay, it levels the playing field to come up with other things, to use those resources creatively.
It democratizes the art.
Yeah, but I think it frees up brain power. It frees up physical resources. But working with vinyl is something that I'm incredibly comfortable with. And I've embraced the shortcomings. But I'm also getting to the point where it's like, maybe I should start looking at digital, just because of the sheer amount of music that's unavailable to me. It opens up doors to getting access to using music that I can't use because it doesn't exist in a physical format right now.
Okay, last question, Colin. This is another softball one, but this is important for me to ask this to you. Best advice for new DJs?
That's a tough one, because part of me is saying, find somebody to give you a basic rundown on how things work, and get a head start by sort of learning things, going through tutorials, learning how to do things. But the other part of me is saying, the only way you're ever really going to find your own style is by making your own mistakes and developing your own techniques and learning things on your own. And it's kind of hard to balance those two.
Yeah. So learning by doing, as they say.
Yeah. Maybe finding a balance between the two. But don't be obsessed with perfection. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, to get things wrong, because I think sometimes wrong just means wrong right now. Sometimes wrong just means it hasn't been done before, or that it hasn't been refined enough to work yet.
That's a great line. Sometimes wrong just means wrong right now. And I think that's a very profound thing to say. That resonates with me a lot. I'll use that as the subtitle for this episode. Colin, thank you so much for giving me an hour of your time for this interview. It's been great.
No problem.
Is there anything you'd like to plug, or anything you'd like to mention, or before we go?
I'm just saying, like, all the artists that I've mentioned, Dormouse has a new split record with DJ Producer, with artwork by the absolutely amazing Josh Decker from Minneapolis, who did my logo, has done logos for like the Mobcore crew in Chicago. Like, Joe Cervix has a new record out. There's so much stuff. Just go out there and find it.
Shout out to Joe. He gets a lot of shout outs on the show.
Yeah, I'm sure Dormouse gets a lot of shout outs.
All right.
Aaron gets a lot of shout outs. Kurt gets a lot of shout outs. Both Kurts. I've talked about 2 Kurts tonight.
Thanks, Colin. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Go check out Fishead. Do you have a website? Yeah, you have a website, right?
Fishead.com.
Fishead.com. 1H. I made the 2H mistake back in the day, printing out a bunch of gig posters.
I've got a 3H flyer somewhere too.
Oh God. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.